Father McKenna's hands trembled as he rewound the security footage for the third time that morning, his coffee growing cold on the desk beside him. The timestamp read 7:43 a.m., exactly when morning chapel began, when all children should have been accounted for in the sanctuary. Yet there was Mavie, animated in a way the priest had never witnessed, his small body turned toward the corner of the herb garden where only shadows and dying plants should have been. The boy's lips moved rapidly, forming words in what appeared to be Chinese, his dark eyes bright with an engagement that seemed impossible for a child who hadn't spoken a single word in English since his arrival 3 years ago. Mavie gestured with his hands, pointing at different sections of the garden as if receiving a guided tour, occasionally nodding or shaking his head in response to unheard questions. Most unsettling of all was the laughter, pure, joyful sounds that the security microphone barely captured, but that Father McKenna could read in the curve of the boy's shoulders, the tilt of his head. This was not the withdrawn, fearful child who flinched at sudden movements and hid behind larger children during group activities. This was a different Mavie entirely. The priest paused the footage at 8:17 a.m., the moment when Mavie appeared to wave goodbye to his invisible companion. The boy's face held an expression of profound contentment, a serenity that seemed far too mature for his 7 years. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, the familiar mask of silence descended, and Mavie became the ghost child they all knew, careful, watchful, alone. "Father?" Sister Margaret's voice startled him from the doorway. "You missed morning prayers. Is everything—" She stopped mid-sentence when she saw the frozen image on the screen. "Is that little Mavie? I've never seen him so animated." Father McKenna rubbed his tired eyes. At 62, he'd been caring for abandoned and orphaned children for over 3 decades. He'd seen trauma manifest in countless ways: night terrors, behavioral outbursts, regression, selective mutism like Mavie's. But this felt different, charged with something he couldn't name. "He spoke yesterday," he said quietly. "First words we've heard from him since his adoption placement fell through. He wanted to tell me about someone he calls Maria." Sister Margaret moved closer, studying Mavie's image with the practiced eye of someone who'd helped raise hundreds of displaced children. "What did he say about her?" "That she visits him in the garden, that she knows stories about his parents." Father McKenna's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "He said she speaks Chinese, Margaret. The boy's files indicate he spoke only Mandarin until age 4, but we've never heard him use it here. How would he even remember?" The nun was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands clasped before her. "Children hold on to more than we realize sometimes. Trauma can lock memories away, but it can also preserve them in unexpected ways." She paused, studying the priest's troubled expression. "You think there's more to this?" It wasn't a question. Sister Margaret had worked alongside Father McKenna long enough to recognize when something had shaken his usually unflappable faith in rational explanations. "Watch this," he said, rewinding to an earlier segment. At 7:52 a.m., Mavie suddenly looked up from the rosemary bush he'd been examining, his entire posture changing. He scrambled to his feet and moved to a different part of the garden, settling cross-legged near the wooden fence as if someone had called to him. His face lifted upward with the kind of rapt attention reserved for beloved storytellers. "He's listening," Sister Margaret observed, "really listening. Not the way he pretends to during lessons, for 9 minutes straight. Then he starts responding, asking questions. In Chinese, Margaret. Fluent, natural conversation with someone who isn't there." They watched in silence as the scene played out, Mavie occasionally wiping his eyes as if moved to tears, other times covering his mouth to stifle giggles, always maintaining that upward gaze as though someone taller knelt beside him among the herbs. "Have you spoken to Dr. Reeves?" Sister Margaret asked, referring to the child psychologist who consulted at St. Catherine's. "That's my next call." "But Margaret—" Father McKenna stopped the footage and turned to face her fully. "In 31 years of ministry, I've learned to distinguish between a child's fantasy and something else entirely. This feels like something else." The nun studied his face, noting the lines of worry that had deepened overnight. "What are you thinking?" Before he could answer, a soft knock interrupted them. Mrs. Chen, no relation to Mavie despite the shared surname, peered around the doorframe. The elderly kitchen volunteer's expression was puzzled. "Excuse me, Father, but I think you should know. That little boy, Mavie, he just asked me for extra rice for lunch. In perfect Mandarin." Her brow furrowed. "He wanted to know if I could pack some in a container, said he wanted to share it with a friend in the garden." Father McKenna and Sister Margaret exchanged glances heavy with implications neither was ready to voice. The afternoon routine at St. Catherine's proceeded with the mechanical precision that had governed Mavie's world for 3 years, 8 months and 12 days, not that anyone else was counting. After lunch, the children were expected to spend an hour in supervised study time before outdoor recreation. Mavie sat at the scarred wooden desk he'd claimed by virtue of being too invisible for anyone else to want it. Positioned near the back corner where he could observe without being observed. Around him, 17 other children bent over worksheets or whispered about trading cards and playground alliances. Mavie understood English perfectly now. Dr. Reeves had confirmed his comprehension was well above grade level, but the social architecture of childhood remained as foreign to him as the Latin phrases Father McKenna muttered during evening prayers. He watched Tommy Kowalski help Sarah Martinez with her multiplication tables, watched Elena Rodriguez pass a folded note to her best friend Jessica, watched these small intimacies with the detached fascination of an anthropologist studying an alien species. The container of rice sat heavy in his backpack, warm against his spine through the thin fabric. Mrs. Chen had packed it carefully in a small Tupperware container, adding a plastic spoon and a knowing smile that made something flutter in Mavie's chest. She was the only adult at St. Catherine's who looked at him without that particular blend of pity and professional concern that he'd learned to recognize in the faces of social workers, therapists, and well-meaning volunteers. "Reading time," announced Miss Patterson, the afternoon supervisor whose voice could cut glass. The children dutifully pulled out their assigned books, picture books for the younger ones, chapter books for Mavie's age group. He'd been given the secret garden 3 weeks ago, and the irony wasn't lost on him, though he doubted Miss Patterson had chosen it deliberately. Nothing about Miss Patterson suggested that kind of subtle insight. Mavie opened to page 47, where Mary Lennox was discovering the hidden door in the ivy-covered wall. He'd read this scene 17 times already, each time wondering if Mary felt the same electric anticipation that hummed through his own veins every morning when he pushed through the loose board in St. Catherine's back fence. The book made it seem magical, the way Mary found Colin and brought the garden back to life. But books always made everything seem more magical than real life, where gardens held frost-killed tomatoes and conversations that might not exist outside his own desperate imagination. The doubt crept in during moments like this, surrounded by the ordinary world of homework and supervision and children who spoke to each other instead of empty air. What if Dr. Reeves was right about trauma-induced coping mechanisms? What if Maria was just his mind's way of creating the mother figure that everyone kept insisting he needed? The rational explanation felt heavy in his stomach, heavier than the rice he was saving for someone who might not be real. But then he remembered the way Maria had known about his birthmark, the crescent-shaped mark on his left shoulder blade that wasn't visible unless he was shirtless. She'd mentioned it casually yesterday, saying how his birth mother used to trace it with her finger while singing lullabies. How could his imagination know something so specific? Mavie Chen. Miss Patterson's voice cut through his thoughts. "You've been on the same page for 10 minutes. Focus, please." He nodded and turned the page mechanically, but his attention drifted to the window that faced the garden. From here he could just see the corner where the rosemary grew wild against the fence, where Maria appeared each morning like an answer to prayers he was too afraid to voice. The other children had their friendships, their shared jokes and whispered secrets. Mavie had stolen conversations with a woman who called him by his real name, not the anglicized version the adoption agency had suggested, but the name his birth mother had chosen, with its particular cadence that sounded like music when Maria spoke it. The clock above the blackboard showed 43 more minutes until outdoor time. 43 minutes until he could slip away from the organized chaos of playground activities and find his way to the garden, where either magic waited or madness was slowly claiming him. The distinction mattered less each day. What mattered was that somewhere in this institutional maze of good intentions and broken children, he'd found a place where he wasn't broken, where someone looked at him with recognition instead of professional sympathy. The rice container pressed against his back like a secret, like proof of something he couldn't name. Mrs. Chen had asked no questions when he'd explained about sharing with a friend, had simply smiled and added extra vegetables as if she understood something about friendship that the rest of St. Catherine's staff had missed. Maybe she knew what it felt like to be caught between two worlds, two languages, two versions of yourself that never quite aligned. Mavie turned another page and tried to lose himself in Mary's story, but his real life had become more compelling than fiction. Tomorrow morning, Maria would be waiting among the herbs, ready to continue the story she'd started about his parents, about the life he might have lived if circumstances had been different. The disruption came not as a gentle knock or whispered announcement, but as the sharp crack of Miss Patterson's ruler against her desk, followed by words that made Mavie's blood turn to ice water. "Mavie Chen, please gather your things. You have a visitor." The classroom fell silent except for the whispered rustle of children turning to stare. Visitors meant social workers. Social workers meant questions about placement, about families who might want a quiet Chinese boy who didn't cause trouble. Visitors meant the possibility of being moved again, of losing the garden, of losing Maria before he'd learned everything she had promised to tell him. Mavie's hands trembled as he closed the secret garden, the irony of leaving Mary Lennox behind now sharp enough to cut. The rice container seemed to burn against his back through the canvas of his backpack, evidence of something he couldn't explain to adults who lived in a world where conversations required two visible participants. Miss Patterson's expression softened slightly when she saw his face. "It's all right, sweetheart. Father McKenna is waiting for you in his office." The hallway stretched endlessly before him, each step echoing off the polished linoleum like a countdown. Through the tall windows, afternoon sunlight slanted across the garden, where frost had claimed more of the tomato plants overnight. In a few hours, when the dinner bell rang and the other children scattered to evening activities, he would have slipped away to that quiet corner where Maria waited with stories about his birth mother's courage and his father's gentle hands. Now that sanctuary felt as fragile as the dying vines. Father McKenna's office door stood ajar, and through the gap Mavie could see unfamiliar shoes, polished black leather that belonged to someone who wore suits instead of clerical collars. His throat tightened with the familiar panic that had learned to live in his chest like a second heartbeat. Adults in expensive shoes made decisions about children like him. They carried clipboards and spoke in professional voices about appropriate placements and therapeutic environments. "Come in, son." Father McKenna's voice carried none of its usual warmth. Instead, Mavie heard something that might have been wonder or fear, or both twisted together into something unrecognizable. The man in the expensive shoes turned as Mavie entered, and everything about him screamed government official, from his steel-grey hair to his briefcase to the way he studied Mavie with the intense focus of someone assembling a puzzle. But it was the manila folder in his hands that made Mavie's stomach drop, because he recognized the red seal across its edge. He'd seen that same seal on the papers that had followed him from placement to placement, the documents that contained whatever terrible truth had made him unwanted by everyone except St. Catherine's. "Mavie," Father McKenna said carefully, "this is Mr. Patterson from the Department of Social Services. He has some questions about your conversations in the garden." The words hit like physical blows. They knew. Somehow they knew about Maria, about the stories, about the way he'd finally found someone who looked at him without pity. Mavie's hand instinctively moved to his backpack strap, feeling the weight of the rice container that was supposed to be proof that someone cared enough to share a meal with him. Mr. Patterson opened the folder, and Mavie caught a glimpse of photographs, grainy security camera images that showed him sitting alone among the herbs, his face animated with joy that now felt impossibly naive. "Son, we need to talk about who you've been speaking to." The room tilted sideways. Mavie gripped the back of the chair in front of him, his knuckles white against the dark wood. They had been watching him, recording him, studying his moments of happiness like symptoms of a disease that needed treatment. "We're not here to get you in trouble," Mr. Patterson continued, his voice carrying the practiced gentleness that adults used when they were about to destroy your world. "But we've discovered some information about your birth parents that we think you should know. Information that might explain why you've been seeing things." The folder opened wider, revealing documents with Chinese characters alongside English translations. Mavie saw his birth mother's name written in careful black ink, saw words like psychiatric evaluation and religious delusions, and claimed divine visitation scattered across the pages like landmines. Father McKenna leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. "Mavie, your birth mother told the authorities that she spoke with the Virgin Mary before you were born. She claimed to receive visions, messages about your future." The rice container pressed against Mavie's spine like a promise he might not be able to keep. In the garden, Maria would be waiting, ready to finish the story about his parents' love and sacrifice. But here, in this office, surrounded by official documents and concerned adults, that story was being rewritten into something clinical and broken. Mr. Patterson's voice cut through his spinning thoughts. "We need to know exactly what this woman has been telling you, son. Because if she's real, we have some very serious questions about how she knows what she knows." The choice crystallized before him like frost forming on glass. Tell them everything and lose Maria forever, or protect the garden's secrets and face whatever consequences came with that silence. Mavie's lips pressed together, sealing away the words they wanted to hear. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled only with the tick of Father McKenna's ancient clock and the distant sound of children playing in the courtyard. Mavie's heart hammered against his ribs as he stared at the documents spread across the desk, official papers that reduced his birth mother's love to psychiatric terminology and transformed Maria's gentle presence into evidence of inherited madness. "Son?" Mr. Patterson's voice carried the patient tone of someone accustomed to coaxing secrets from frightened children. "We know this is difficult, but we need to understand what's been happening." The words lodged in Mavie's throat like stones. How could he explain that Maria's stories felt more real than anything in this sterile office? That when she spoke about his birth mother's courage, something deep inside him recognized the truth of it? The adults wanted clinical facts, but Maria dealt in something far more precious, the kind of love that transcended death and bureaucracy and the neat categories that social workers used to file away broken children. Father McKenna shifted forward, his expression gentler than Mr. Patterson's professional concern. "Mavie, you're not in trouble. But if someone has been telling you stories about your parents, we need to know how she learned these details. Some of this information," he gestured toward the folder, "some of this was sealed, classified. Only a handful of people have access to these records." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Either Maria was something beyond human understanding, or someone with high-level security clearance was manipulating a grieving 7-year-old for purposes too terrible to contemplate. The rational explanation made Mavie's stomach churn, but the alternative, that his birth mother's prayers had somehow reached across the divide between life and death, felt equally impossible. Mavie's fingers found the strap of his backpack, tracing the canvas like a lifeline. Inside, the container of rice waited, growing cold with each passing moment. Mrs. Chen had packed it with such care, adding extra vegetables and that knowing smile that suggested she understood something about friendship that transcended the visible world. But now, even that kindness felt contaminated by doubt. What if Maria never came to share the meal? What if he sat alone in the garden tomorrow morning, talking to empty air while hidden cameras recorded his descent into the same delusions that had claimed his birth mother? "The woman in the surveillance footage," Mr. Patterson continued, pulling out a series of photographs that showed Mavy's animated conversations with apparent emptiness. She knew details about your birth parents' relationship, their hopes for your future, even the lullabies your mother sang. Information that exists nowhere in any official record. The words crashed over Mavy like cold water. If Maria's knowledge came from sealed files, then every story she'd shared was stolen truth, repackaged as divine intervention to manipulate a lonely child. But if her knowledge came from somewhere else, somewhere beyond the reach of government databases and psychological evaluations, then admitting to these conversations would invite scrutiny that might destroy whatever fragile miracle had brought her into his life. Mavy thought of yesterday morning, when Maria had laughed at something he'd said about the stubborn rosemary that refused to die despite the frost. Her laughter had sounded like wind chimes, like his earliest memories of safety and warmth. Could professional manipulators fake that kind of joy? Could government conspiracies manufacture the way Maria's eyes crinkled when she smiled, or the careful way she pronounced his real name? "We're trying to protect you," Father McKenna said quietly. "Your birth mother suffered from severe mental illness. She believed she received divine messages, prophetic visions about your destiny. The authorities documented extensive delusions about angelic visitations and direct communication with religious figures." The clinical language felt like knives against Mavy's skin. They were transforming his birth mother's faith into pathology, reducing her love to symptoms that needed treatment. But what if they were right? What if the capacity for seeing things that weren't there lived in his blood like a genetic time bomb, waiting to explode his carefully constructed world into fragments of impossible truth and inevitable disappointment? The rice container seemed heavier now, weighted with questions that had no safe answers. Tomorrow morning, Maria would either be waiting among the herbs or she wouldn't. The meal would either be shared in communion with something holy or consumed alone while concerned adults watched through hidden cameras, documenting his journey toward institutional care and medicated silence. Mr. Patterson leaned back in his chair, studying Mavy with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that might reshape everything he thought he understood about the world. "Son, we need you to help us understand. Because if this woman is real, we have to find her. And if she's not," he gestured toward the psychological evaluations scattered across Father McKenna's desk. "If she's not, then we need to get you the kind of help that might prevent you from following the same path as your birth mother." The choice crystallized with brutal clarity: betrayal or madness, truth or safety, Maria or sanity. Mavy's lips pressed tighter together, sealing away words that could destroy everything. The silence that followed felt like a living thing, pressing against the walls of Father McKenna's office until the very air seemed to vibrate with tension. Mavy stared at the photographs scattered across the desk, black and white images of himself gesturing animatedly to empty space, his face bright with joy that now seemed like evidence of madness. The clinical distance of the camera made his conversations with Maria look exactly like what the adults feared: a lonely child talking to himself, constructing elaborate fantasies to fill the void where love should have lived. But Mavy remembered the weight of Maria's hand on his shoulder when he'd cried about forgetting his birth mother's voice. He remembered the way she'd hummed the lullaby that had unlocked memories he thought were lost forever. No camera could capture the warmth that radiated from her presence, or the way the garden seemed to bloom with possibility when she appeared among the frost-touched herbs. "Son?" Mr. Patterson's voice carried an edge now, patience wearing thin. "We need an answer. Who have you been talking to?" The moment stretched between them like a bridge he could either cross or burn. Behind him lay the safety of silence, the institutional care that would keep him fed and housed and thoroughly monitored. Ahead lay something vast and unknowable, a territory where his birth mother's faith intersected with impossible visitations and sealed government files. Mavy's hand moved to his backpack, feeling the weight of the rice container that Mrs. Chen had packed with such loving care. Tomorrow morning, Maria would be waiting in the garden, ready to continue the story she'd been telling about his real parents. She would ask about the rice, about whether he'd found the courage to trust in something larger than his own small understanding of the world. The choice wasn't really between truth and fiction, Maeve realized. It was between two different kinds of truth: the documented clinical truth that lived in manila folders and psychological evaluations, and the deeper truth that pulsed through his veins when Maria called him by his real name. The adults wanted him to choose their version of reality, where love could be quantified and miracles were symptoms that needed treatment. "I need to go to the garden," Maeve whispered, the words barely audible. Father McKenna and Mr. Patterson exchanged a look heavy with meaning. "Son, it's almost dinner time," Father McKenna said gently. "The garden will be there tomorrow." But that was exactly what Maeve feared, that tomorrow would bring doctor's appointments and medication, and the kind of help that would make Maria's visits impossible. He thought of his birth mother, alone in some sterile facility, trying to convince skeptical professionals that her visions were real. Had she felt this same terrible weight, this crushing awareness that choosing faith meant choosing to be labeled broken? "She's waiting for me," Maeve said, his voice stronger now. The words felt like stepping off a cliff, like crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Mr. Patterson leaned forward, his pen poised above a notepad. "Who's waiting for you, Maeve?" The question hung in the air like a trap. Once he spoke her name, gave her form and substance in this room full of officials and evidence, Maria would become part of their investigation. They would search for her with the tools of their rational world: background checks and fingerprint databases and psychiatric evaluations. They would try to reduce her to something that fit their understanding of how the universe worked. But maybe that was exactly what needed to happen. Maybe the crossing of this threshold required more courage than Maeve had ever imagined, not just the courage to believe in something impossible, but the courage to defend that belief against a world determined to explain it away. "Maria," he said, and the name fell into the silence like a stone into deep water. "Her name is Maria, and she knew my mother before I was born." The adults went very still. Mr. Patterson's pen hovered over his notepad, and Father McKenna's weathered face cycled through a dozen expressions before settling on something that might have been awe or terror. "Maria," Mr. Patterson repeated carefully. "And she tells you stories about your birth parents?" Maeve nodded, feeling the weight of secrets lifting from his shoulders, even as a heavier burden settled there, the responsibility of protecting something sacred in a world that would dissect it like a laboratory specimen. "She comes to the garden every morning. She speaks to me in Chinese the way my real mother did." The admission felt like setting fire to everything safe and predictable in his life. There would be no going back now, no retreating into silence when the questions became too difficult or the scrutiny too intense. He had committed himself to Maria's impossible truth, and whatever consequences that choice carried would have to be faced in that quiet garden where frost-covered rosemary refused to die, and prayers took the shape of gentle women who called lonely children by their real names. Outside the window, evening shadows stretched across the courtyard, and somewhere beyond the institutional walls, the garden waited with all its terrible, wonderful secrets intact. The questioning continued well past dinner, stretching into the evening hours until the orphanage settled into its familiar rhythm of whispered conversations and creaking floorboards. When Maeve was finally dismissed, his legs felt unsteady beneath him, as if the ground itself had shifted during those hours of interrogation. Mr. Patterson had filled an entire notepad with details about Maria's visits, her appearance, the stories she told. Each answer Maeve gave seemed to deepen the furrow between the man's brows, transforming wonder into something that looked dangerously like determination. "We'll need to monitor the garden," Mr. Patterson had said to Father McKenna as Maeve gathered his backpack. "If this Maria is real, she's compromised classified information. If she's not," he'd let the implication hang in the air like a verdict waiting to be pronounced. Now, walking through the dormitory's dim hallway, Maeve felt the weight of every gaze that followed him. Word had spread with the efficiency that only institutional gossip could achieve. The other children whispered behind cupped hands about government men and mysterious ladies and Mavy's sudden transformation from silent outsider to the center of something vast and incomprehensible. "Is it true you talk to ghosts?" Tommy Brennan blocked his path near the bathroom door, his freckled face alive with curiosity and something that might have been envy. Behind him, 3 other boys formed a loose semicircle, their expressions ranging from wonder to suspicion. Mavy clutched his backpack tighter, feeling the rice container shift inside. The meal had grown cold hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to eat it without Maria's presence to sanctify the sharing. "She's not a ghost," he whispered, then immediately regretted speaking at all. "Then what is she?" This, from Sarah Martinez, who'd appeared beside them with the fluid grace that made her the unofficial leader among the older children. Her dark eyes held an intensity that reminded Mavy uncomfortably of Mr. Patterson's professional scrutiny. "Because Father McKenna looks like he's seen the devil himself, and Mrs. Murphy keeps crossing herself every time someone mentions your name." The observation sent ice through Mavy's veins. He'd been so focused on protecting Maria from the adults' investigation that he hadn't considered how his revelations might affect the other children. St. Catherine's was their sanctuary too, their refuge from a world that had already proven its capacity for abandonment and betrayal. If his conversations with Maria brought unwanted attention, government scrutiny, or worse, closure, he would be responsible for destroying the only home any of them had known. "I don't know what she is," Mavy admitted, the truth feeling like a confession of failure. "But she knows things about my real parents, things that make me remember." Sarah's expression softened fractionally. Among all the children at St. Catherine's, she alone seemed to understand the particular ache of incomplete memories, the way the past could feel simultaneously precious and painful. "And you think that's worth risking everything for? Worth bringing those government people here?" The question cut deeper than any of Mr. Patterson's professional interrogations. Mavy thought of Maria's gentle smile, the way she'd helped him remember his birth mother's lullabies, the stories about love that had transcended death itself. But he also thought of the manila folder on Father McKenna's desk, the photographs that made his joy look like madness, the clinical language that transformed faith into pathology. "I don't know," he whispered, and the admission felt like betraying Maria and protecting her simultaneously. "Well, you better figure it out fast," Tommy said, his voice carrying an edge that belonged to someone much older. "Because Mrs. Murphy says they're bringing in doctors tomorrow. The kind that ask questions about what goes on inside your head." The words hit like physical blows. Mavy had hoped the investigation would focus on finding Maria, proving her existence through conventional means. Instead, they were preparing to study him, to peer into his thoughts and emotions with the same clinical detachment they'd applied to his birth mother's case. The rice container seemed to burn against his spine, a reminder of promises he might not be able to keep. "Maybe," Sarah said quietly, "you should warn her. This Maria, tell her what's coming." The suggestion carried both kindness and calculation. If Maria was real, she deserved to know that their secret meetings had been exposed. If she wasn't, if she was some manifestation of inherited delusion, then facing that truth might be the first step toward healing. Either way, tomorrow's sunrise would bring answers that might reshape everything Mavy thought he understood about faith, family, and the space between what was possible and what was real. As the group dispersed toward their respective dormitories, Mavy felt the weight of isolation settling over him like a familiar coat. Tomorrow he would sit in the garden with cameras watching, doctors analyzing, and the terrible knowledge that his choice to trust had set forces in motion that no 7-year-old should have to navigate alone. The dormitory fell into its usual restless quiet, but sleep eluded Mavy like a frightened animal. He lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling where moonlight painted shifting shadows through the barred windows. The rice container rested on his nightstand, still wrapped in Mrs. Chen's cheerful cloth napkin, a small beacon of normalcy in a world that had tilted dangerously off its axis. Around him, the other children's breathing settled into the rhythms of uneasy dreams. Tommy Brennan muttered something about government spies in his sleep, while across the room, Marcus Chen, no relation to the kitchen worker, tossed and turned with the restlessness that came from sensing adult anxiety without understanding its source. Even in sleep, the orphanage carried the weight of tomorrow's uncertainties. Mavie's fingers traced the edge of his blanket, counting the frayed threads like prayer beads. In a few hours, men with clipboards and clinical vocabularies would arrive to peer into his mind, searching for the genetic inheritance that had supposedly driven his birth mother toward delusion and death. They would ask about voices that weren't there, visions that couldn't be real, the dangerous intersection of faith and mental illness that ran through his bloodline like a curse waiting to manifest. But Maria wasn't a symptom or a hallucination. She was warmth in a world gone cold, knowledge where there should have been only questions, the living proof that love could transcend the boundaries that adults use to contain their understanding of the possible. When she called him by his real name, something inside him recognized truth in a way that had nothing to do with documentation or evidence. The thought of warning her, as Sarah had suggested, created its own terrible paradox. If Maria was real, she already knew what was coming. Divine knowledge should encompass government investigations and psychiatric evaluations. But if she was some creation of his own desperate loneliness, then tomorrow's confrontation would force him to face that truth in front of strangers who would document his breakdown with the same clinical precision they'd applied to his birth mother's case. A soft sound from the hallway made him freeze, footsteps, too light to belong to any of the night supervisors. Someone was moving through the dormitory with the practiced stealth of institutional survival, navigating between floorboards that creaked and doorways that squealed on ancient hinges. The footsteps paused outside his door, and Mavie held his breath, wondering if Mr. Patterson had decided that overnight observation was necessary. Instead, Sarah's voice whispered through the crack beneath the door. "Are you awake?" Mavie slipped from his bed, feet finding the cold linoleum without a sound. Years of midnight navigation had taught all the orphans how to move like ghosts through their temporary home. He eased the door open to find Sarah standing in the hallway, fully dressed despite the late hour. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, though her knowing expression suggested the question was rhetorical. They walked toward the common room without speaking, their footsteps muffled by institutional carpet that had absorbed countless conversations about uncertain futures and abandoned pasts. The space felt different at night, larger somehow, shadows stretching the familiar furniture into unfamiliar shapes that seemed to whisper about all the children who had passed through these rooms on their way to somewhere else. "I keep thinking about your birth mother," Sarah said, settling into one of the worn armchairs that faced the window overlooking the garden. About what it must have felt like, being the only one who could see what she saw. Mavie curled up in the chair beside her, pulling his knees to his chest. Through the glass, the garden lay silver and still under the moon's attention, frost making the surviving herbs glitter like scattered stars. Tomorrow, that peaceful space would be filled with cameras and observers, transformed from sanctuary into theater for whatever drama was about to unfold. "Maybe she wasn't crazy," Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. "Maybe she just saw something that the rest of the world wasn't ready to understand." The words carried weight that pressed against Mavie's chest like a physical thing. He thought of the manila folder, the sealed records that documented his birth mother's decline from devoted parent to psychiatric patient. And she felt this same terrible isolation, this awareness that choosing faith meant choosing to be labeled broken by a world that measured sanity by its ability to conform to documented reality. "I'm scared," Mavie whispered, the admission falling into the darkness like a stone into deep water. "Good," Sarah said, her pragmatism cutting through sentiment with surgical precision. "Being scared means you understand what you're up against." Outside, the garden waited with all its frost-touched secrets intact. In a few hours, the sun would rise on whatever truth had taken root in that quiet space between the possible and the impossible. Mavie pressed his face to the cool glass, wondering if Maria was watching too, preparing her own approach to a confrontation that would demand more courage than any 7-year-old should have to summon alone. Dawn came too soon, arriving like a reluctant witness to what promised to be the most important day of Mavie's 7 years. He'd dozed fitfully in the common room chair, Sarah's steady breathing beside him the only anchor in a night that seemed determined to stretch toward infinity. When Mrs. Murphy found them there at 5:30, her expression cycled through irritation, understanding, and something that might have been pity before settling on the brisk efficiency that kept institutions running despite the chaos of human emotion. "Up, both of you," she said, though her voice carried none of its usual sharp edges. "Mavie, you'll want breakfast before they arrive. Sarah, help him get ready." The next hour passed in a blur of mechanical actions, showering, dressing in his least worn clothes, forcing down scrambled eggs that tasted like cardboard. Mrs. Chen pressed the rice container into his hands as he left the dining hall, her eyes bright with tears she couldn't afford to shed during working hours. For sharing, she whispered in Mandarin, and Mavie felt something crack inside his chest at the words. By evening, there might be no one left to share with, no gentle voice calling him by his real name in the language his birth mother had whispered during those first 3 years of his life. The garden waited exactly as it always had, unchanged by human scrutiny or government interest. Frost still clung to the rosemary bushes, and the withered tomato vines still traced delicate patterns against the chain-link fence. But the space felt different now, observed, measured, transformed from sanctuary into evidence. Mavie could sense the cameras that Mr. Patterson's team had installed overnight, their mechanical eyes focused on the spot where Maria usually appeared. He settled onto the familiar wooden crate, rice container balanced on his knees, and waited. The morning air bit through his jacket, sharp enough to make his breath visible in small clouds that dissipated like prayers into the pale sky. Somewhere behind him, he knew Father McKenna and Mr. Patterson were watching from the administration building's windows, clipboards ready, theories forming like storm clouds on the horizon of his small world. 7 o'clock came and went, then 7:15. By 7:30, Mavie felt the first tendrils of real panic beginning to snake through his chest. Maria had never been late, never failed to appear when he needed her most. Had the cameras frightened her away? Did divine visitations cease to function under government surveillance? Or, and this thought brought with it a terror that made his hands shake, had she never been there at all? "She's not coming, is she?" The voice belonged to Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, the child psychologist who had arrived that morning with a leather briefcase full of assessment tools and the kind of gentle authority that made resistance seem both futile and impolite. She approached across the frost-touched ground with careful steps, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Sometimes," Dr. Hartman continued, settling onto a nearby overturned flower pot with the practiced ease of someone who made a career of meeting children in their chosen spaces, "when we're under a lot of stress, our minds create companions to help us feel less alone. It's not lying and it's not being crazy, it's just being human." Mavie clutched the rice container tighter, feeling the weight of Mrs. Chen's love and expectations pressing against his palms. Everything he'd learned about Maria, about his birth mother's faith, about the intersection of love and loss that had shaped his short life, it all balanced on the knife's edge of this moment. The cameras watched, the adults waited, and somewhere in the space between hope and terror, truth prepared to reveal itself in whatever form it chose. "She speaks to me in Chinese," Mavie whispered, testing the words against the morning air. "She knows my real name." Dr. Hartman nodded with professional compassion. "You must miss your birth mother very much. It would make sense that your mind would create someone who could give you the connection you lost." The explanation felt like a door closing, like the final classification that would transform his experiences from miracle to symptom. But even as despair began to rise in his throat, Mavie heard something that made every muscle in his body freeze, the soft sound of footsteps on frost-covered earth, approaching from the direction of the fence. "Maria?" he called, his voice breaking on the name. Dr. Hartman followed his gaze toward the empty space beside the withered tomato vines, her expression cycling through professional interest and growing concern. In the administration building's windows, he could see Father McKenna leaning forward, Mr. Patterson's hand moving toward whatever communication device would summon additional help. The moment stretched like a bridge between two worlds, and Mavie realized that whatever happened next would determine not just his future, but his understanding of what was possible in a universe that seemed determined to reduce faith to pathology and love to documented evidence. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the morning fell into a silence so complete that Mavie could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Dr. Hartman's pen remained poised above her clipboard, frozen mid-observation, while her eyes tracked his gaze toward the empty space that had once held all his hope. "Maria?" Mavie whispered again, desperation bleeding through the syllables. The frost-covered earth showed no impressions, no evidence of the gentle presence that had transformed this forgotten corner into sanctuary. Only the bitter October wind answered, stirring the withered tomato vines in a mockery of arrival. Dr. Hartman's expression shifted from professional curiosity to active concern. "Mavie, there's no one there. Can you tell me what you think you're hearing?" The question landed like a physical blow. Think you're hearing? Not what he was hearing, but what his damaged mind had conjured from grief and genetic predisposition toward delusion. The rice container slipped in his trembling hands, Mrs. Chen's cheerful napkin suddenly feeling like a shroud wrapped around his last connection to the woman who had known his real name. "She was supposed to come," Mavie said, his voice cracking on the words. "She always comes. She promised she would tell me about my real parents." Behind Dr. Hartman, he could see Mr. Patterson emerging from the administration building, his purposeful stride suggesting that whatever was happening had crossed some predetermined threshold. Two additional figures followed, men in dark suits whose presence transformed the garden from sanctuary into crime scene. "Sometimes," Dr. Hartman said, her voice carrying the practiced gentleness of someone delivering difficult diagnoses. "When we want something very badly, our minds can create experiences that feel completely real. It doesn't mean you're lying or that you're sick, but it might mean you need help processing some very difficult feelings." The clinical language wrapped around Mavie's throat like a noose. He thought of his birth mother, alone in some sterile room, while doctors explained her visions in the same compassionate tones, reducing divine intervention to chemical imbalance and inherited pathology. Had she felt this same crushing weight as reality collapsed around her faith? "She knew things," Mavie insisted, clutching desperately at the fragments of truth that were slipping through his fingers. "About my birth mother's lullabies. About why I was named Wei Ming. Information that could have come from your memories or from overheard conversations between the staff," Dr. Hartman explained, each word another nail in the coffin of his belief. "Children are remarkably good at absorbing details they don't consciously remember." Mr. Patterson reached them as the first sob broke from Mavie's chest. The rice container tumbled from his lap, spilling its contents across the frost-covered earth in a scatter of white grains that looked like tiny bones against the dark soil. Mrs. Chen's love, transformed into evidence of his pathetic delusion. The surveillance equipment detected no anomalous readings during the specified time frame, Mr. Patterson reported, his voice carrying the finality of scientific conclusion. No electromagnetic fluctuations, no temperature variations, no audio signatures beyond the subject's own vocalizations. Subject, not Mavie, not even the boy, just another case study in inherited mental illness, documented and classified for future reference. He wrapped his arms around his knees, making himself as small as possible while the adults discussed his psychological evaluation as if he weren't sitting 3 feet away, falling apart in real time. "I'd like to continue our conversation inside," Dr. Hartman said, her hand extending an invitation that felt more like capture, somewhere warmer, more comfortable. But Mavie couldn't move, couldn't abandon the space where Maria's presence had once made him whole. The garden held all his memories of feeling loved and understood, of having his real name spoken with tenderness instead of clinical precision. To leave now would be admitting that it had all been fantasy, that his desperate loneliness had constructed elaborate delusions from fragments of hope and half-remembered love. She was real, he whispered, though the words felt hollow even to his own ears. The empty air mocked him, the scattered rice bearing witness to his complete and devastating failure. He had trusted, had spoken, had allowed hope to grow in the space between faith and evidence. Now that hope lay dying in the frost, leaving only the terrible weight of inherited madness and the knowledge that he was following his birth mother's path toward documented insanity. Father McKenna appeared at the garden's entrance, his face grey with a grief that seemed to encompass more than just one small boy's breakdown. Behind him, Mavie could see other children pressed against the dormitory windows, their faces reflecting the horror of watching sanctuary transform into medical emergency. The rice grains glittered like tears against the dark earth, and Mavie understood with devastating clarity that some kinds of faith could not survive the bright lights of scientific scrutiny. Maria was gone, had perhaps never been there at all, leaving only the echo of Mandarin lullabies and the crushing weight of a 7-year-old's shattered belief in miracles. Father McKenna's approach across the frost-covered ground carried a weight that had nothing to do with his physical presence. His face bore the kind of profound sorrow that Mavie had learned to recognize in the expressions of adults who carried institutional responsibility for damaged children. But as he drew closer, something in his eyes suggested a different kind of burden entirely. "Mavie," Father McKenna said, his voice rough with an emotion that cut through the clinical atmosphere like a blade. "There's something you need to know." Dr. Hartman looked up sharply from her clipboard, professional protocols clearly being violated by whatever was about to unfold. Mr. Patterson stepped forward, his government authority suddenly seeming insufficient against the gravity of Father McKenna's presence. "Father, perhaps this isn't the appropriate time," Dr. Hartman began. "The appropriate time was 3 years ago," Father McKenna interrupted, his words carrying decades of suppressed guilt. "Before that boy spent months talking to empty air because we were too afraid to tell him the truth about what we found in his mother's effects." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Mavie felt his grip on the wooden crate loosening as Father McKenna reached into his jacket and withdrew something that made the morning air suddenly feel thin and electric, a small hand-carved wooden figure of a woman in blue robes, her painted face worn smooth by countless touches. "This belonged to your birth mother, Li Wei," Father McKenna said, settling onto the cold ground beside Mavie with the careful movements of a man carrying unbearable weight. She clutched it during her final hospitalization, talking to it in Mandarin even when the doctors insisted she was speaking to hallucinations. The carved figure seemed to pulse with significance in Father McKenna's weathered hands. Mavie recognized something in the woman's painted features, the gentle expression, the way her robes fell in familiar folds, the sense of infinite compassion carved into wood by desperate hands. "The nurses recorded some of what she said during those final weeks," Father McKenna continued, his voice breaking slightly. "She spoke about sending protection to her son, about how love could transcend death if faith was strong enough. She called the figure Maria, after the Virgin Mary who had appeared to her in dreams since childhood." Dr. Hartman's pen had stopped moving entirely. Mr. Patterson stood frozen, his scientific certainty suddenly looking fragile against the tide of information that was reshaping everything they thought they understood. "Your mother believed," Father McKenna swallowed hard, gathering courage for words that had clearly haunted him for years. "She believed that, if she prayed hard enough, if she poured enough love into her devotions, Mary would find a way to visit you after she was gone, to tell you the things she never had the chance to say." Mavie's hands trembled as he reached for the carved figure. The moment his fingers made contact with the worn wood, something electric shot through his nervous system, not supernatural but achingly, overwhelmingly familiar. This was what his birth mother's hands had touched during those final desperate months. This was where she had directed her love when the world insisted her visions were symptoms. "We should have given it to you immediately," Father McKenna whispered, tears now flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. But the psychiatrist warned us about encouraging what they called inherited delusional patterns. We were afraid that giving you her religious artifacts would trigger the same episodes that had destroyed her mental health. The carved Mary felt warm in Mavy's palms despite the October cold. As he studied her painted features, memories began cascading through his consciousness, not supernatural visitations, but fragments of his earliest childhood. His birth mother's voice singing Mandarin lullabies while holding this same figure. Her gentle corrections when he mispronounced his name, the way she called him Wei Ming, bright destiny, while tracing these same carved folds with reverent fingers. "The woman you've been talking to," Father McKenna said softly. "She looks like this figure, doesn't she?" Mavy nodded, understanding finally blooming in his chest like a flower breaking through frozen ground. Not hallucination, not divine visitation, but something far more complex and infinitely more human. His own mind, desperate for connection, had reconstructed his birth mother's presence from buried memories and unconscious love, speaking to him in the language she had used during those precious early years. Dr. Hartman set down her clipboard entirely, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine amazement. "The mind's capacity to preserve and reconstruct emotional memory is extraordinary," she murmured, "especially in cases of profound early attachment." But Mavy barely heard her clinical observations. He was lost in the revelation that Maria had been both real and imaginary, real in the sense that she carried his birth mother's actual love, imaginary in that she existed only in the space between memory and desperate need. The rice scattered around his feet suddenly seemed less like evidence of failure and more like offerings to a love that had found a way to transcend death through the sheer force of a child's need to be known. His birth mother's final prayers had been answered, just not in the way anyone had expected. For several heartbeats, the only sound in the garden was the whisper of wind through bare branches. Mavy held the carved figure against his chest, feeling the worn wood pulse with 3 years of suppressed connection. The adults around him seemed frozen in tableau. Dr. Hartman with her abandoned clipboard, Mr. Patterson's government certainty cracking like ice in spring, Father McKenna's shoulders shaking with the weight of finally released truth. Then something extraordinary happened. Instead of feeling diminished by understanding Maria's true nature, Mavy felt himself expanding, growing stronger in ways that had nothing to do with supernatural intervention and everything to do with finally grasping the magnitude of his birth mother's love. She had fought for him, not through mystical visitation, but through the deeper magic of maternal devotion that could embed itself so completely in a child's consciousness that it survived death, medical evaluation, and institutional fear. "She never left me," Mavy whispered, his voice carrying a clarity that made the adults lean closer. "Not really." Dr. Hartman slowly approached, her professional demeanor transforming into something more human. "Your mind created a way to access the love she gave you during those early years. That's not pathology, Mavy. That's resilience." For the first time since the surveillance began, Mavy felt no shame about his conversations with empty air. Maria had been constructed from real memories, real love, real words his birth mother had spoken while holding this same carved figure. The rice scattered at his feet no longer looked like evidence of delusion, but proof that love could find expression even when filtered through a child's desperate longing. Father McKenna wiped his eyes with shaking hands. "There's more," he said quietly. "Your mother left letters, dozens of them written during her final weeks. The hospital classified them as religious ideation, but I've been keeping them in the safe, waiting for the day you were old enough to understand." Mr. Patterson stepped forward, his official demeanor softening. "The surveillance we conducted, It wasn't just about documenting supernatural claims. We've been tracking several children with similar experiences. Children whose parents died young, leaving behind intense spiritual artifacts and unfinished emotional business. Your case isn't isolated, and it isn't pathological. The revelation hit Mavie like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He wasn't alone in this experience. Somewhere, other children had found ways to access love that transcended traditional boundaries, building bridges between memory and need through the architecture of devoted attention. Mrs. Chen appeared at the garden entrance, her face creased with concern until she saw Mavie holding the carved figure. Recognition dawned in her expression, not surprise, but the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had finally been confirmed. She approached with slow, respectful steps. "I knew there was something," she said gently, settling beside him on the cold ground without regard for her clean uniform. "The way you moved in that garden, the peace in your face when you came back from these visits. No hallucination creates that kind of healing." Dr. Hartman knelt beside them, her clinical training now working in service of understanding rather than diagnosis. "Mavie, what you've experienced is a form of what we call continuing bonds, the psychological processes that allow relationships to persist beyond death through memory, ritual, and emotional connection. Your mother's prayers weren't answered through supernatural intervention, but through something equally profound, your mind's ability to preserve and access the love she gave you." The weight of the carved Mary in his hands felt different now, not evidence of inherited madness, but proof of love's persistence across time and trauma. The garden around him looked the same: frost-touched rosemary, withered tomato vines, chain-link fence marking boundaries, but it had transformed from a place where he was broken into a space where he had found ways to heal himself. "The letters your mother wrote," Father McKenna continued, "they're full of stories about your early childhood, about the lullabies she sang, about why she chose your name. She was trying to preserve everything she could for you to find later." Mavie looked up at the circle of adults surrounding him, not with the suspicious monitoring he'd grown accustomed to, but with genuine respect for what he had accomplished. Through months of patient attention to his own desperate need, he had managed to reconstruct enough of his birth mother's love to keep himself whole. Maria might have been imaginary, but the healing she had facilitated was absolutely real. "Can I read them?" Mavie asked, his voice steady with new confidence. "The letters?" Father McKenna nodded, tears still fresh on his weathered cheeks. "You can read them, keep them, and understand that your mother's final wishes weren't delusional. She wanted you to find your way back to love, and through your conversations with Maria, imaginary or not, that's exactly what happened." The rice scattered around his feet caught the pale October sunlight like small promises kept. Mavie understood now that he wasn't broken or destined for his mother's fate. He was beloved, resourceful, and capable of finding connection even in the spaces between memory and desperate hope. Mavie clutched the carved Mary tighter, feeling the worn grooves beneath his fingertips, where his birth mother's hands had traced the same path during her final prayers. The truth about Maria settled around him like a warm coat, not the devastating collapse he had expected, but something that made him feel larger, more capable than he had ever imagined possible. "I want to finish what she started," he said, his voice carrying a determination that surprised even himself. The adults around him exchanged glances, but Mavie's attention had already shifted beyond their circle of concern towards something more pressing. "She left me these memories for a reason." Father McKenna leaned forward, his weathered face creased with both hope and apprehension. "What do you mean, finish what she started?" Mavie stood slowly, still holding the carved figure against his chest like a talisman. The scattered rice crunched softly under his feet as he turned toward the dormitory windows where other children's faces pressed against the glass. Their expressions reflected fear, curiosity, and something else, a desperate hunger that Mavie recognized because he had carried it himself for so long. "They need to know," he said, gesturing toward the watching children. "About love that doesn't disappear. About parents who find ways to stay connected, even when everyone says it's impossible. Dr. Hartman's professional mask slipped entirely, revealing genuine concern. Maeve, you can't take responsibility for helping other children process grief. That's not your burden to carry. But Maeve was already walking toward the dormitory, his steps gaining confidence with each stride. Behind him, he could hear the adults scrambling to follow, their voices mixing with concern and protest. The weight of his choice pressed against his shoulders, not the crushing burden of inherited madness, but the purposeful weight of someone who had found something precious and refused to keep it hidden. The dormitory door opened before he reached it, disgorging a stream of children who had been watching from windows and whispered conversations. Sarah Martinez stepped forward first, her 7-year-old face set with the kind of determination that came from witnessing someone else's breakthrough. Was she real? Sarah asked, her voice carrying the careful hope of someone who had her own conversations with empty air. The lady you talked to? Maeve looked at Sarah's expectant face, then at the circle of children gathering around him. Tommy, who talked to his dead father's baseball glove. Anna, who saved half her dinner every night for a mother who would never come. Marcus, whose nightmares about his grandmother had slowly transformed into comforting dreams that left him peaceful instead of terrified. She was real in the way that matters, Maeve said carefully, holding up the carved Mary so everyone could see. This belonged to my birth mother. She held it and prayed that I would never forget how much she loved me, and I didn't forget. My mind just found a different way to remember. The circle of children tightened around him, their faces reflecting varying degrees of understanding and desperate hope. Behind them, Maeve could see more staff members emerging from the building. Social workers, counselors, administrators drawn by reports of the boy who had been talking to visions finally sharing his truth with an audience. Mrs. Chen appeared beside him, her presence both supportive and protective. What you're doing is important, she said quietly, but it's also dangerous. Some of these children have parents who specifically requested that religious or spiritual explanations be avoided in their care. Maeve felt the weight of consequence settling around him like a heavy blanket. By choosing to speak publicly about his experience, he was potentially violating the careful boundaries that kept St. Catherine's operating within secular guidelines. His truth could destabilize the institutional structures that provided stability for dozens of other damaged children. But as he looked at Sarah's face, at Tommy clutching his father's glove, at Anna's thin shoulders carrying the weight of endless waiting, Maeve understood that some truths were too important to protect through silence. His birth mother had fought against medical dismissal and institutional fear to preserve her love for him. Now he needed to fight against administrative caution and professional boundaries to share what he had learned. "I'm not telling anyone what to believe," Maeve said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd of children and adults. "I'm just saying that love doesn't disappear the way everyone thinks it does. It finds ways to survive, even when the people we love can't stay with us." Father McKenna stepped forward, his face grave with understanding. "Maeve, if you continue down this path, there will be consequences. Questions from the Archdiocese, reviews of our policies, possibly investigations into how we handle cases involving religious experience." The morning air felt electric with possibility and danger. Maeve understood that his next words would determine not just his own future at St. Catherine's, but potentially reshape how the institution approached the spiritual needs of grieving children. The carved Mary pulsed warm against his palm, carrying 3 years of suppressed connection and the accumulated weight of his birth mother's desperate final prayers. "Then let them investigate," Maeve said, his 7-year-old voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived the worst kind of abandonment and found his way back to love. "Some things are more important than being safe." The words hung in the October air like a challenge thrown down before the universe itself. Father McKenna's face went pale. Dr. Hartman stepped backward as if physically struck, and Mr. Patterson reached instinctively for his phone, all of them recognizing that this moment would ripple far beyond the forgotten garden of St. Catherine's orphanage. But it was Sarah Martinez who moved first. The 7-year-old girl stepped forward, her small hand reaching toward the carved Mary in Mavy's palm. "My mama left me her rosary," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Sometimes I hold it and I can hear her singing." The admission cracked something open in the gathered circle. Tommy clutched his father's baseball glove tighter against his chest. Anna's thin frame straightened with newfound possibility. Around them, more children emerged from doorways and shadows, drawn by the electric sense that someone was finally speaking truths they had been carrying alone. "This is exactly what we were trying to prevent," Dr. Hartman said urgently, her clinical training warring against the evidence unfolding before her. Group suggestion, shared delusion patterns. "No," Mavy's voice cut through her protests with startling clarity. 3 years of silence had taught him the power of choosing words carefully, and now each syllable carried the weight of accumulated understanding. "It's not delusion if it helps us heal." Father McKenna's weathered hands trembled as he watched more children stepping forward, each clutching some small artifact of connection, a photograph, a piece of jewelry, a worn stuffed animal that had belonged to someone lost. The priest's institutional training battled against deeper recognition of what was happening. This wasn't mass hysteria or religious mania. This was a group of abandoned children finally finding permission to access love they had been told was gone forever. "The Archdiocese will shut us down," Father McKenna whispered, but his protest lacked conviction. "They'll say we're encouraging unhealthy attachment to the dead, promoting superstition over proper grief counseling." Mavy felt the carved Mary pulse warm in his palm, carrying not supernatural power but something more profound, the accumulated weight of his birth mother's desperate prayers finally finding their intended target. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, children whose eyes held the first spark of hope they had shown in months, adults whose professional certainties were cracking under the pressure of witnessing something that transcended their training. "My birth mother fought doctors who said her visions were symptoms," Mavy said, his 7-year-old voice carrying authority that made grown-ups lean closer. "She fought nurses who wanted to medicate her love away. She fought a system that said grief was supposed to follow rules and finish on schedule." He held the carved figure higher, letting sunlight catch the worn wood. "I won't let her fight be wasted by staying quiet." Mrs. Chen moved to stand beside him, her presence both protective and supportive. "The children have been carrying these experiences alone," she said quietly, addressing the circle of administrators and counselors. "Mavy isn't creating something new. He's giving them permission to acknowledge what was already there." Mr. Patterson's official composure finally cracked entirely. "Do you understand what you're risking?" he asked, his government training warring against growing respect for the boy's courage. "There will be investigations, reviews, psychological evaluations for every child here. The state could remove funding, separate families, transfer children to facilities with stricter secular protocols." The weight of consequence pressed against Mavy's shoulders like a physical force. By refusing to keep his truth contained within safe boundaries, he was potentially destabilizing the lives of every child at St. Catherine's. His choice to speak could scatter this fragile community like seeds in a storm, sending damaged children into systems that might be far less understanding than the one they knew. But as he looked at Sarah's face, at the way Tommy's posture had straightened with new possibility, at Anna's thin hands carefully touching something precious hidden in her pocket, Mavy felt his birth mother's final prayers settling around him like armor. She had risked everything, her credibility, her mental health classification, her peaceful death, to preserve love for a son she would never see grow up. "Then let them come," Mavy said, his words carrying across the gathered crowd with the finality of someone who had already survived the worst possible loss. "Let them investigate and review and evaluate. They'll find children who were dying from loneliness, learning how to heal themselves through connection." He lifted the carved Mary toward the pale October sky, letting her worn features catch the light. "My mother taught me that some kinds of love are stronger than institutions, stronger than fear, stronger than professional boundaries." The silence that followed felt electric with possibility and terror. Everyone present understood that this moment would be remembered, either as the day a brave child transformed how an institution approached grief, or as the beginning of an administrative disaster that would scatter dozens of vulnerable children across an unforgiving system. Maeve stood at the center of it all, finally ready to discover which truth would prove stronger. The sound of footsteps on gravel shattered the electric silence. Maeve turned to see Director Williamson striding across the courtyard, his face thunderous with the kind of institutional fury that had crushed countless children's spirits over the decades. Behind him marched three figures in dark suits, archdiocese officials whose presence transformed the morning air into something sharp and dangerous. "Step away from the children, Father McKenna," Director Williamson commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had built a career on containing problems before they could spread. "This ends now." The circle of children instinctively pressed closer to Maeve, their small bodies forming a protective barrier around the boy who had finally given voice to their hidden truths. Sarah clutched her mother's rosary tighter. Tommy's knuckles went white around his father's baseball glove, and Anna's hand found the precious something in her pocket that she had never shown anyone. "Children, return to your dormitories immediately," one of the suited men called out, his tone carrying the practiced dismissal of someone who viewed their experiences as symptoms to be managed rather than truths to be honored. "No." Maeve's voice cut through their commands with startling clarity. He stepped forward, the carved Mary held against his chest like a shield blessed by 3 years of desperate prayer. "We're not running anymore." Director Williamson's face went crimson with rage. This was his worst nightmare materializing before his eyes, a child openly defying institutional authority while surrounded by witnesses who could carry the story beyond his carefully controlled environment. "You are a disturbed 7-year-old boy with documented behavioral problems," Williamson said, his words designed to reduce Maeve back to the manageable category of damaged child. "Your delusions are contaminating other vulnerable children who need professional treatment, not supernatural fairy tales." The cruelty in his voice hit Maeve like a physical blow, but instead of crumbling, the boy felt something inside him crystallize into unbreakable purpose. This was the moment his birth mother had prepared him for through months of patient conversations with Maria. Not supernatural intervention, but the accumulated strength to face institutional cruelty without losing sight of love's persistence. "My mother wasn't disturbed," Maeve said, his young voice carrying across the courtyard with growing power. "She was dying, and she was fighting to leave me something stronger than abandonment." "You want to call that delusion? You want to medicate it away and file it under pathology?" He lifted the carved figure toward the pale October sky. "Then you'll have to explain why it worked." Father McKenna stepped forward, his weathered face set with new determination. "Director Williamson, these children have shown more emotional progress in the past hour than in months of traditional counseling. Perhaps we should consider—" "Father McKenna, you are relieved of your duties pending investigation," the lead archdiocese official interrupted. "Your failure to contain this situation has created a liability risk that extends far beyond this institution." The words hit the priest like physical blows, but Maeve watched his shoulders straighten rather than slump. Something was shifting in the adults around him, not just Father McKenna, but Mrs. Chen, Dr. Hartman, even Mr. Patterson. They were witnessing something that transcended their professional categories, and institutional pressure was forcing them to choose sides. "You can fire Father McKenna," Mrs. Chen said quietly, her voice carrying the steady authority of someone who had spent years actually caring for these children. "You can investigate and evaluate and transfer every child here to facilities with stricter protocols. But you cannot erase what they've experienced. You cannot medicate away love that has already taken root." Director Williamson turned on her with fury. "Mrs. Chen, you are also—" "What?" Maeve interrupted, his 7-year-old voice suddenly filling with the accumulated power of every conversation with Maria. every moment in the garden where he had learned to trust his own experience over others' dismissal. You'll fire everyone who refuses to pretend that love disappears when people die. You'll scatter all of us to different institutions because we found ways to heal that don't fit in your policy manuals? The circle of children around him seemed to grow larger, their presence more solid. Other kids were emerging from doorways and windows, drawn not by supernatural forces, but by the magnetic pull of someone finally speaking truths they had been carrying alone in the darkness of institutional silence. "You think you're protecting us," Mavie continued, his words carrying the weight of his birth mother's final prayers, transformed into present-moment courage. "But you're protecting yourselves. You're protecting a system that's afraid of anything it can't control, measure, or file away in the proper category." The autumn wind picked up, rustling through the withered garden behind him, the space where a desperate child had found ways to reconstruct love from memory and need. Director Williamson's face was white with institutional terror. The archdiocese officials were reaching for phones to call for backup, and the gathered children were watching with the intense attention of people witnessing someone fight for their right to love and be loved, beyond the boundaries of professional comfort. This was the confrontation his birth mother had prepared him for, not with supernatural forces, but with the grinding machinery of systems that preferred damaged children to remain conveniently broken. The moment stretched like a held breath before Director Williamson's composure finally shattered completely. "This institution will not be destroyed by one delusional child's fantasy," he snarled, reaching for Mavie's arm with the practiced efficiency of someone who had physically removed countless problems over the years. But as his hand closed around Mavie's thin wrist, something extraordinary happened. The boy didn't resist, didn't pull away, didn't cry out in fear. Instead, he looked up at Director Williamson with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of every conversation with Maria, every moment of learning to trust love over fear. "You can take me away," Mavie said quietly, his voice carrying across the courtyard with startling clarity. "You can scatter everyone here to different institutions. You can fire every adult who believes children deserve more than just survival." He held the carved Mary tighter against his chest. "But you can't take this from me, and you can't stop what's already started." The truth of his words hit everyone present like a physical force. Sarah was clutching her mother's rosary with new understanding, her 7-year-old face radiant with permission to love someone who couldn't stay. Tommy had pulled his father's baseball glove from beneath his jacket, holding it openly for the first time since arriving at St. Catherine's. Anna's hand emerged from her pocket carrying a small silver locket that caught the October sunlight like a beacon. All around the courtyard, children were stepping forward with their own hidden treasures. Photographs wrapped in tissue paper, worn stuffed animals that smelled like home, jewelry that carried the warmth of hands now gone. The careful walls of institutional protection were crumbling before Director Williamson's eyes, revealing the truth that these children had never stopped loving, had never stopped hoping, had never stopped carrying connections that transcended death and abandonment. "This ends now," Director Williamson repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. He was witnessing something that made his decades of administrative experience irrelevant, genuine healing that had emerged organically from the connections he had spent years trying to suppress. Mavie felt the weight of choice settling around him like his birth mother's final embrace. He could submit quietly, let himself be removed to spare the other children the chaos of institutional upheaval. He could protect this fragile community by sacrificing his own truth, allowing the adults to contain and manage what had been unleashed. But as he looked at the faces surrounding him, children whose eyes held light for the first time in months, adults whose professional certainties were transforming into deeper understanding, Mavie realized that some victories required losing everything you thought you needed to keep. "I won't be quiet anymore," he said, his words carrying the finality of someone who had already survived the worst possible abandonment. "My birth mother fought alone against doctors and nurses and administrators who wanted to reduce her love to symptoms. She died fighting to preserve something for me." He lifted the carved figure toward the pale sky. "I won't waste her sacrifice by choosing safety over truth." The silence that followed felt like the moment before lightning strikes. Everyone present understood that this decision would reshape not just Mavy's future, but the lives of every child and adult connected to St. Catherine's. The archdiocese officials were already reaching for phones to call for immediate intervention. Director Williamson's face was white with institutional panic. The carefully maintained boundaries that had kept this community stable were dissolving before their eyes. Father McKenna stepped forward, his weathered hands trembling as he placed them gently on Mavy's shoulders. "Son, do you understand what this will cost? They'll separate you from everyone here. They'll send you to a facility designed for children with serious behavioral problems. You'll lose Mrs. Chen, lose the garden, lose every connection that has helped you heal." Mavy felt tears burning behind his eyes as the full weight of consequence crashed over him. By refusing to contain his truth within safe boundaries, he was sacrificing the only family he had known for 3 years. He would lose the gentle rhythms of St. Catherine's, the adults who had learned to speak his language of careful silence, the children who were just beginning to trust their own experiences of love beyond death. But his birth mother's final prayers had taught him that some kinds of love could only survive through courage that looked like destruction from the outside. She had risked everything, her credibility, her peaceful death, her son's immediate safety, to preserve something stronger than institutional protection. "Then I'll lose everything," Mavy said simply, his 7-year-old voice carrying the authority of someone who had discovered what his birth mother always knew. "But they'll never be able to say it didn't happen. They'll never be able to pretend that love disappears when it becomes inconvenient." Around him, the circle of children pressed closer, their small bodies forming a protective barrier around the boy who was sacrificing his world to validate theirs. The morning air hummed with the electricity of transformation that could not be contained or controlled, only witnessed as it changed everything it touched. The weight of Mavy's declaration settled over the courtyard like snow, beautiful and inevitable, and changing the landscape forever. For a moment that stretched beyond time, no one moved. The archdiocese officials stood frozen with phones half raised. Director Williamson's face cycled through expressions of rage and panic, and the circle of children held their breath as if exhaling might shatter the fragile courage their friend had just displayed. Then Sarah stepped forward, her small hand finding Mavy's free one. "I won't let them take you alone," she whispered, her mother's rosary gleaming between her fingers. The words carried across the silence with startling clarity, and Tommy moved to Mavy's other side, his father's baseball glove pressed against his chest like armor. "Me neither," Tommy said, his voice cracking but determined. Around the courtyard, other children began moving closer, not running, not hiding, but walking with the careful dignity of people who had finally found something worth defending. Director Williamson's administrative composure crumbled completely. "Children, return to your dormitories immediately, or you will all face consequences." "No." The word came from Anna, spoken so quietly that everyone had to strain to hear it. The girl who hadn't spoken above a whisper in 8 months stepped into the circle, her silver locket catching the October light. "We won't go back to pretending." Father McKenna felt something breaking open in his chest, not destruction, but the kind of painful expansion that happened when institutional walls gave way to human truth. These children weren't being manipulated or encouraged toward delusion. They were finally being allowed to grieve and love and heal in ways that honored both their loss and their resilience. "Director Williamson," he said quietly, his weathered voice carrying new authority. "Look at them. Really look." He gestured to the children surrounding Mavy, faces that had been grey with institutional depression now radiant with purpose, shoulders that had carried hopelessness now straight with shared courage. "When have you ever seen them like this?" Mrs. Chen moved to stand beside the priest, her presence both protective and defiant. "In 3 years of working with these children, I have never witnessed healing like what happened in the past hour. Not through therapy, not through medication, not through any protocol in our manuals." Her voice grew stronger, Mavie isn't creating problems. He's revealing solutions we were too frightened to recognize. The lead archdiocese official stepped forward, his phone finally connecting to whatever authority he'd been trying to reach. "This is Father Morrison. We need immediate intervention at St. Catherine's. Multiple children are displaying concerning attachment behaviors, and staff members are actively encouraging—" "Encouraging what?" Dr. Hartman interrupted, moving to join the growing circle of adults around the children. "Encouraging healing, encouraging authentic grief processing, encouraging children to trust their own capacity for love." Her professional mask had fallen away entirely, revealing the human being who had chosen child psychology because she believed in children's resilience, not their pathology. Mavie watched the adults choosing sides around him, understanding dimly that his refusal to stay quiet had created ripples that extended far beyond his own fate. Mrs. Chen might lose her position. Father McKenna was already suspended. Dr. Hartman was risking her professional reputation by defending approaches that existed outside accepted therapeutic frameworks. But as he looked at Sarah's face, at the way Anna was finally standing straight, at Tommy's protective stance, Mavie felt his birth mother's presence settling around him like a blessing. Not supernatural intervention, just the accumulated power of love that had refused to accept abandonment as the final word. "My mother died fighting for this," he said, his young voice carrying across the courtyard with growing clarity. "She fought doctors who said love was symptoms. She fought nurses who wanted to medicate grief into convenient schedules. She fought a system that said connection was supposed to follow rules and finish when institutions decided it was healthy." He lifted the carved Mary toward the pale sky. "She won. Look around, she won." The truth of it was undeniable. Children who had been isolated in their grief were standing together. Adults who had been hiding behind professional distance were choosing courage over comfort. The careful boundaries that had kept everyone safely separate were dissolving into something messier and more real and infinitely more hopeful. Director Williamson made one final attempt at control. "Security is coming to remove the disruptive elements," he announced, his voice hollow with the authority of someone whose power was already evaporating. "This institution will return to proper protocols." Mavie felt the moment crystallizing around him like his birth mother's final prayer taking physical form. Everything was about to change. For him, for the children surrounding him, for every adult brave enough to defend what they had witnessed. But instead of fear, he felt only the deep peace of someone who had finally learned the difference between safety and love. "Then let them come," he said simply, his words carrying the finality of transformation that could no longer be contained. Around him, the circle of children and adults held steady, ready to face whatever consequences emerged from choosing truth over institutional convenience. The morning air hummed with the electricity of love that had finally found its voice. The security guards who arrived 15 minutes later found something that defied every protocol in their emergency response manual. Instead of one disruptive child requiring removal, they discovered 37 children and 6 adults standing together in the courtyard, with the quiet dignity of people who had already won the only battle that mattered. Mavie stood at the center, still holding his mother's carved Mary, but something fundamental had shifted in his 7-year-old frame. The careful stillness that had protected him for 3 years had transformed into the kind of peace that came from choosing truth over survival. He was no longer the withdrawn boy who spoke only when cornered. He was someone who had found his voice by learning what it meant to use it for others. "Sir, we need you to step away from the other children," the lead security officer said gently, clearly confused by the scene before him. This wasn't the aggressive disruption he'd been called to contain, but neither was it the compliant institutional order he understood how to restore. "I can't do that," Mavie replied simply. His voice carried no defiance, no anger, just the quiet authority of someone who had discovered the difference between being alone and standing alone. "They're my family." The words hit Father McKenna like a revelation. In all his years of managing institutionalized children, he had been so focused on providing safety and structure that he'd forgotten children needed more than survival. They needed belonging that transcended professional care. Watching Mavie claim these connections publicly, at the cost of everything he might lose, the priest finally understood what his birth mother had been fighting to preserve. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her hand finding Mavie's shoulder with the protective instinct of someone who had chosen love over employment security. This child has spent months learning to trust again. He's not being disruptive, he's being brave. Around them, the other children pressed closer, creating a human shield that was both deeply moving and utterly heartbreaking. Sarah clutched her mother's rosary with new purpose. Tommy held his father's glove like a banner, and Anna's silver locket caught the autumn light as she whispered encouragements that carried the authority of shared experience. Director Williamson's face had taken on the greyish pallor of someone watching his carefully maintained world dissolve before his eyes. These children require specialized intervention, he insisted to the security team, but his voice lacked conviction. The evidence surrounding him contradicted everything he was trying to claim. Children who had been withdrawn and depressed were displaying more emotional health than he'd seen in years. Dr. Hartman moved to join the protective circle, her professional composure replaced by the fierce protectiveness of someone who had finally remembered why she'd chosen child psychology. "I've been working with institutionalized children for 15 years, she told the security officers. What you're witnessing isn't pathology. It's healing that emerged organically when one child was brave enough to model authentic grief processing. Mavie felt the moment settling around him with the weight of permanence. The security guards were clearly reluctant to physically separate children who were causing no actual disruption. The archdiocese officials were documenting everything for reports that would reshape policies across multiple institutions. Director Williamson was realizing that his authority had been built on compliance that no longer existed. But more than the external victory, Mavie felt an internal transformation that his birth mother's love had made possible. He was no longer the terrified boy who hoarded connection in secret. He was someone who could stand publicly in the space between loss and hope, holding both his grief and his healing as gifts rather than burdens. "I know what's going to happen," he said quietly, addressing the adults whose decisions would determine his immediate future. "You'll separate us because institutions are designed to contain rather than connect. You'll send me somewhere with stricter protocols and higher walls." He lifted the carved Mary toward the pale October sky. "But you can't take this from any of us." The truth resonated across the courtyard with the authority of love that had been tested by loss and refined by courage. These children would carry what they'd experienced into whatever institutions received them. The adults who had chosen to stand with them would remember that healing sometimes looked like disruption from the outside. The careful boundaries that had kept everyone safely isolated had been replaced by connections that transcended professional categories. Father McKenna felt tears he hadn't cried in decades burning behind his eyes as he watched Mavie transform from a patient requiring management into a teacher offering gifts the institutional world desperately needed. The boy's birth mother had fought alone against systems that reduced love to symptoms. But her son wasn't fighting alone. He was surrounded by a community that had learned to choose courage over convenience. As the security guards finally moved to begin the process of administrative separation, Mavie felt his mother's final prayer completing itself around him like an embrace that could survive any institutional response. He had returned to his world changed, not by supernatural intervention, but by learning to trust that love could persist beyond every attempt to contain or control it. The new beginning. 3 months later, on a January morning that painted Denver in crystalline white, Mavie Chen walked through the front gates of St. Catherine's carrying a small suitcase and the carved Mary that had survived every attempt at confiscation. The boy who returned bore little resemblance to the one who had been removed in October, not because his essential nature had changed, but because he had learned to carry his truth openly rather than guard it in careful silence. The institutional upheaval his courage had triggered had reshaped everything. Director Williamson had resigned under pressure, replaced by someone who understood that healing required connection rather than containment. Father McKenna had been reinstated after the Archdiocese investigation concluded that spiritual experiences deserved pastoral care rather than psychiatric intervention. Mrs. Chen had been promoted to head of therapeutic services, her gentle wisdom finally recognized as expertise rather than unprofessional sentiment. But the deepest changes were visible in the children who rushed to greet him in the courtyard where everything had begun. Sarah moved with new confidence, her mother's rosary worn openly rather than hidden. Tommy's laughter carried across the space without the careful restraint that had once muffled his joy. Anna spoke in full sentences now, her voice clear and strong as she called Mavy's name. "You came back," she said, wonder filling her words as if she had barely dared to hope for this moment. Mavy set down his suitcase and opened his arms to embrace her, his heart full with the knowledge that separation had only strengthened rather than severed their connections. "I promised I would," he said simply. "Family doesn't disappear just because institutions try to manage it." The months apart had taught him things that no amount of therapy or medication could have provided. In the residential facility where he'd been placed, he had encountered children whose stories of loss mirrored his own. By sharing what he had learned about grief that honored rather than abandoned love, he had discovered that his birth mother's final prayer extended far beyond his individual healing. It was about transforming every space where abandoned children learned to trust again. Dr. Hartman appeared in the courtyard doorway, her professional demeanor softened by months of learning to recognize healing that existed outside traditional therapeutic frameworks. "Welcome home, Mavy," she said, and the word home carried new meaning for all of them. This wasn't just a placement or an institution, it was a community that had chosen to define family by courage and connection rather than blood or legal documents. Father McKenna emerged from the chapel, his weathered face bright with joy that no longer required hiding behind pastoral reserve. The priest had spent the months of Mavy's absence working with church officials to develop new protocols for children reporting spiritual experiences, guidelines that honored rather than pathologized encounters with the sacred. The boy's courage had created space for institutional wisdom that balanced faith and reason rather than sacrificing one for the other. "The garden has been waiting for you," Father McKenna told Mavy, his voice warm with the kind of welcome that acknowledged both the pain of separation and the joy of return. "Mrs. Chen has been tending your mother's herbs, but she said they needed their proper gardener." Together, the group moved toward the space where it had all begun. The small plot where frost-covered rosemary and dormant tomato vines had once mirrored Mavy's own sense of abandonment. Now the winter garden held the quiet promise of spring, dormancy that contained rather than denied the certainty of renewal. Mavy knelt beside the herb bed, his small hands touching earth that felt like sacred ground. He no longer needed supernatural visitations to feel his birth mother's presence. It lived in every choice to love beyond loss, every decision to trust despite abandonment, every moment when someone chose courage over the safety of emotional isolation. "She's here," he said quietly, but not to empty air. He was speaking to the children and adults surrounding him, people who had learned to recognize love that persisted beyond death, beyond institutional boundaries, beyond every attempt to reduce connection to symptoms requiring management. As if in response to his words, Sarah knelt beside him, then Tommy, then Anna, their small hands joining his in the winter soil. The adults followed, Mrs. Chen with tears bright in her eyes, Father McKenna with his weathered face soft with wonder, Dr. Hartman with the professional humility of someone who had learned that healing often required surrendering rather than asserting control. In that moment, Mavy felt the completion of his birth mother's final prayer. Not supernatural intervention, but the accumulated power of love that had refused to accept abandonment as the final word. He had found his way home, not to a place, but to an understanding that family could be chosen and created and defended by ordinary people brave enough to trust that connection mattered more than convenience. The carved Mary rested peacefully in the winter garden, no longer a secret requiring protection, but a reminder visible to anyone who needed to believe that love could survive every attempt to contain it. Around her, a community continued growing that honored both loss and healing, both grief and hope, both the children they had been and the family they were choosing to become. Home, Maeve realized, had never been a destination. It was the courage to love openly in a world that preferred emotional isolation, and it was here, in this quiet Denver garden, among people who had learned that sacred meant not separate from human experience, but deeply, transformatively present within it.